On the rag, the period, anti-flow, time of the month, shark week, strawberry week, the curse. Just a handful of the names we've come up with to talk around something that half the world's population experiences over and over for decades of their lives. For centuries, entire societies have gone out of their way to avoid saying it out loud. This biological process that's essential, literally, to human survival. Across cultures, it's been branded as impurity, as illness, a weakness. And here's the thing, that hasn't gone away. Right now, today, girls are still being taught to fear their own bodies. Women are still made to feel shame over something that happens to them every single month. So why? Why are we still whispering about this? Welcome to GynoCurious. I'm Dr. Amy Novatt, a board-certified OBGYN. From both sides of the speculum, we're here to investigate what it means to be a healer and to be healed. Please send your comments to radiofreerhinecliffe.org. And if you're interested in my clinical practice, please go to draminovatt.com. Please follow us and share the show. My guest today is Lola Mainieri. Lola holds a bachelor's degree in psychology. She dedicated her time in college researching menstruation and has had the privilege to present her research at the 2025 Association for Women in Psychology Conference in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Lola is now pursuing a graduate degree and plans to continue her research in menstruation and work for causes who break down period poverty and stigma. Welcome, Lola.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So I know everyone listening is wondering, why did this woman study menstruation? Mm-hmm. What caused you to go there?
Yeah. So in college, before my senior year, which is when we do our senior projects and everything, I read a book called This Is Your Brain on Birth Control. I actually didn't even finish the full book, but I read a couple chapters of it, and I was really it really spiraled me into learning a lot more about menstrual health and women's bodies in general. So when my advisor came to me asking what I would like to do for my senior project, it was pretty broad. I wanted to do something originally about the effect that your brain has on birth control. But it was kind of too broad of a subject almost. So then we kind of honed in on reproductive justice and led me to a different book called The Curse, A Cultural History of Menstruation by Janice Delaney. And after reading that, I really wanted to study the relationship that your body has with menstruation, depending on the attitudes that you had. So my research in college was pretty much exploring the effect of your relationship with your menstrual attitude. So whether or not you view it in a positive or negative lens, and how that affects your relationship with yourself and the way that you objectify your body. So that's kind of what led me down that path. Yeah.
Did your own personal experience with your menstruation impact the way you experienced both the readings you just described and then your writings?
Yeah, I think I definitely went through the classic, teenage experience of I got my period a little bit late, actually, because I was a competitive athlete. So I think something in my hormonal structure wasn't getting what it needed. So I got my period in high school. So I didn't go through the middle school experience of it all. So I was already coming into myself when I got my period. So it wasn't necessarily that I felt kind of afraid of it, especially because I grew up with two older sisters and I have my mom. So I wasn't afraid of what was happening. I knew what was going on. But I do remember the first time I got my period and I was really still confused, even though I knew that it was coming. It didn't look like I thought it was going to look like. And I was confused about why there was brown, it was brown blood. It wasn't bright blue. Bright red. Oh my goodness. I don't know. So it was really confusing at first. And then, I went through the classic kind of, I don't want anyone to know that I'm on my period. So when you go to the bathroom in high school and you shove the tampon up your sleeve and you walk out of it, so those kind of things. But there was never really an experience that I had where I was super actively, I guess, against my period. There was definitely times where it fluctuated based on my diet and what I was doing and the stress levels and everything. In college, my cycle was definitely really messed up. So it made me focus a lot more on my period. So I think that experience of going through, I was getting my period once every 2 weeks, which is not normal, obviously. So I had to go to a lot of OBG appointments. I had to follow up with a lot of different doctors and get a lot of procedures done. So I got really into this cycle of just like thinking about my period a lot. So I think that's kind of also what led me to like researching it more.
You know, it's so interesting. Every woman I've ever talked to about that first period, which is called the menarche, they describe this kind of confusion about it, no matter how educated they have been. And of course, the majority of women out there have had very poor education around menstruation. So even if you've been really well educated, there's that confusion and mystery and curiosity and fear that goes into that first period, because there's just nothing like having blood coming out of your body.
Absolutely.
And, you know, there's not a scar and there's not an obvious reason for it, right? So, and it's interesting because that first period for almost all young women is that brown, sludgy blood.
Yeah.
So that's, again, nobody ever talks about that. They say it's going to be red. It's going to last 7 days. And, you know, the textbook doesn't really describe it. So you're bringing up something that I'm sure many listeners can relate to. I'm curious whether your advisor at school was a male identified person or female identified person.
She was a female identified woman. Her name was Elena Kim. And I genuinely could not have done the project without her. And she focuses a lot on women's rights as well. So I think having that experience with her and I doing it together was better. And it's not to say that like the male staff at Bard wouldn't have understood, but I think that there was a deeper kind of connection to the project when you know that you have like gone through this yourselves and researching the history of it and connecting that to other people that have menstruated. It's definitely something that I think was really special to have done with someone else that like had been through that experience, you know?
Yeah. Was there any pushback from your family about this area of focus?
Absolutely not. I think my family has always been very supportive of me. They're very body positive. Even like with like my dad, it was never any awkward weirdness. It was a very open household. Like we grew up in Woodstock, so it's very like, you know, like, it's very like body free. Like
that's great.
You know, and I think they were really proud of me. And my dad was the one that took me to the conference in New Mexico, actually, because my mom couldn't go. So he watched my whole presentation. He helped me prepare for it. I had a big support system behind me, which I'm really grateful for.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. You know, again, I've spoken to folks whose area of study were controversial, and they had to search far and wide for someone who could support them, not just with the logistics of a project like this, but from a kind of an emotional support. So I'm so glad both your advisor and your family were clearly, you know, there for you.
Yeah.
What did you call your period when you were growing up? Did you have nicknames?
You know, I actually don't think that I did. I definitely heard them throughout my high school, but I always just called it my period. Okay. You know, I never called it like my menstrual cycle. I feel like that was like a little too proper for me, but I was never like, oh, I'm on my lady days. Like I never have said that. I feel like I was always very like, this is like what this is. I don't find it gross. You know what I mean? Like pretty positive about it. Yeah.
I was thinking about all the verbiage that human beings come up with for bodily functions. And I hear a lot of these expressions or terms in the office. Sometimes I'm like, excuse me, what are you talking about? But I was thinking particularly about defecation and urination.
Yeah.
And I grew up in a house where my father never used any other word other than defecation and urination. And to this day, if I use the word defecation, people look at me like I've got 3 heads. But there, you know, there are certainly nicknames for them for those bodily functions. But I certainly think there's more for the menstrual cycle than any other bodily function. Can you speak to that and why you think that might be true?
I think that using that sort of like coded communication is a little bit more digestible, because I think that people don't really understand. Like, I feel like when you say like urination, it's like everyone kind of knows what that is. And I think when you say like, I'm on my lady days, like my Aunt Flo is here, you know, it kind of is a little bit more like you can hide that. So I think that there's always a little bit of that like underlying shame involved with using that. And part of my conclusion of my thesis is breaking down kind of like I wrote not too much onto it because I wasn't really focused on like exactly the code of communication, but that it's important to just call it what it is. You know what I mean? And it's a way to even internally, like not societally, but like internally, to break down that shame of like just getting comfortable with saying like, yeah, I'm on my period or I'm menstruating. I think it like breaks it down and makes it more easier for inside of you, you know?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's been studies looking at the use of language, particularly around body parts with children. You know, so many children are taught all kinds of names rather than vagina, you know, breast, whatever. And studies have demonstrated that kids have a much better relationship with their body when they use proper anatomical terms. And I think it's some of the same, kind of embarrassment, lack of experience using those words, and then the shaming phenomenon that goes on around our body that I want to kind of focus on. So talk to us about shame and menstruation. We have long history.
Yeah.
So many cultures have enforced, not only physical isolation for menstruating females, they were barred from touching community food and water while menstruating. And even in religious contexts, women were not permitted into temples or to participate in spiritual events. So for a very long time, there's been this phenomenon of how cultures respond to vaginal blood. Can you speak more about that?
Yeah, I wrote a blog recently about the history of menstrual stigma, and diving into the history of it, it's just way more vast than you would honestly think of when you're born into a generation of like, it's a little bit more accepted, but it's still not like 100% accepted. And I think researching that was really eye-opening for me. As you said, a lot of the time women were isolated in menstrual huts. Pretty much there wasn't anything comfortable in there. There wasn't like pads and tampons. It's like kind of just like sticks. And I read something about like a stinging nettle being used to distract away from the pain of the period. For food purposes, it was honestly a lot about food and like contamination. So a lot of the time it was talking about how women weren't allowed to cook for their husband unless they wanted to cause him great harm. Or
I like this concept, right? A monthly opportunity.
Yeah, right. Or like not being able to preserve food. Like that was a big thing. So like pickling, it wouldn't take supposedly if you were menstruating or
even in the medical, in the context of medicine, for centuries, menstrual blood was considered toxic. And there was a belief that women could sour wine, ruin crops, and I love this one, blunt steel. Can you imagine if women had that power?
Yeah.
We'd have no war.
I know.
I mean, I kind of dig that. We'd be using it in a very positive way. But anyway, as you were saying.
I think like speaking of like the supernatural, there was like a concept of calling the energy that exudes off of you during your menstrual cycle called mana. So it's like using that mana, it's like would cause like a bad hunt. So you wouldn't be able to, that's why they were like isolated. So it's like you didn't want that energy to be near you. And actually one of the most fascinating things I learned is that a lot of modern day superstitions were actually because of this fear of mana and like walking under ladders. That was because people didn't want to walk under like bridges or anything that like menstruating women were on. So that's why now we're like afraid to walk under ladders, because we think that mana is gonna kind of like attack you. Or like even like in the opium industry, they weren't allowed to work in the opium industry when you're menstruating because they thought that the opium would turn sour. I was thinking about this, how we see it as like dirty and like contaminated, right? It gets really dark when you read far into it, because I was also reading about this one instance where the woman bled on the bed sheets, which is like, that's happened to all of us. And she was actually later like killed because her husband thought that was the only way to get rid of this negative energy. So it's like, was really kind of like almost a spiritual fear, which is interesting because I feel like it's such a natural biological process. I mean, there is like, if you get like, into like the magic of it all, it's such a beautiful process, but it really is just a biological process that our body has to go to, and there's really nothing supernatural about it. So I think the fear created around it was just like for a sense of control. Men, honestly, they just wanted to like control us, and what's better than to like make us like a taboo or like.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure for centuries there was so little understanding of what the menstruation was. There wasn't an understanding of estrogen and progesterone and the buildup, the lining of the endometrium, and the relationship of menstrual cycles and pregnancy and fertility. So, of course, some of those superstitions were fed by ignorance.
Absolutely.
But it does seem to be true that the patriarchy has impacted women and women's bodies in a variety of ways out of fear and control and imposing power over. Yeah. So again, I kind of alluded to all these historical events. How much of this is still going on in cultures around the world?
I think the most prevalent issue that I see now with menstrual stigma is less about how the whole world is thinking that we're, evil when we're menstruating and that we're like out to kill all men, It's more so, I think, in the lack of education and funding that you see towards young menstruating women. And I think something really interesting is that the first time like an actual menstrual product was tested with blood wasn't until 2023. So this is like, we're really late to the game. And they didn't even test it with real menstrual blood. They used like regular kind of blood, which doesn't take into account the other fluids that are happening in your vaginal like walls. So I think it's still not accurate. So it's really like interesting to think about how we're using these products, but they're really not tested for us. And also, a lot of them were found to be leaching lead and arsenic and a lot of different harmful metals and a lot of name brands. And they had to protect the names of the brands. But you can assume that it was Tampax and like the top brands that everyone has been using since they were like, that's the most successful brand, So I think it's really interesting that not only are they not tested on actual blood, but they're also leaching metals into our bodies. And it's just not researched at all because no one really, I don't know, I think it's just not viewed as like an important.
Well, it's just part and parcel with the absence of science around women's bodies as a whole. And, GynoCurious has mentioned this multiple times, but for so long, science saw us as small men and just assumed that our biological functions were essentially the same. And so many scientists didn't want to study women because of hormones and, of course, pregnancy concerns. And, of course, that's exactly where we need to go. It's changing. There's a lot more information and money being placed on studies of women's bodies throughout hormonal cycles of all ages. So thank goodness. But, it's so interesting, too. I was reading some statistics. I was reading how women today experience up to 450 menstrual cycles in a lifetime.
Wow.
Where centuries ago, women had roughly about 150. And we think this is due to, a younger age at which we have that first menstrual cycle. We're having fewer pregnancies. We're breastfeeding less. There's probably an impact to the endocrine disruptors, things in our foods and our cleaners, all these things that are impacting our hormones and how they function. Contraception. More women, thankfully, have access to contraception, so they're preventing ovulation and menstrual cycles. Let's talk about the issues of kind of the poverty around information, education, resources. I was also reading that 1 in 5 women, 18%, will go to YouTube, online forums, or social media to gather information on menstrual health.
Wow.
And there's so much misinformation out there. More than 6 in 10 women aged 18 to 24, or 63%, say they have learned more about women's health from social media than they did in school. Now, we know sexual ed in a lot of schools throughout this country are extremely limited or don't even exist. And so girls are having to learn about menstruation in other ways. But I am concerned about the number of girls learning about their bodies through the internet, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
So can we talk about, you've already mentioned this concern about lack of science, sanitary protection, albeit has kind of evolved a bit over time. We now have menstrual cups and barriers and period panties, but even those we're finding have some concerns with them. So can you speak, let's start with period poverty.
Yeah.
What does that mean? How can you explain that to the audience?
So period poverty as a broad term is pretty much just like the struggle to afford accessible period products. And there's actually a statistic that 1 in 4 students struggle to afford period products in the United States. And about like half the population menstruates. So that's a lot of young people. A lot of the time people are choosing between affording food versus a period product, right? And this also goes on to like the tax on period products. So it's named as like a luxury good, which is kind of silly because it makes it seem like it's a choice to be menstruating, right? So not only the tax, but just like period poverty in general affects I would say almost everyone in their lifetime. It's really difficult to always have the budget to be affording really expensive period products. And on top of that, organic and healthy ones, right? So it's like if we don't want these products to be leaching metals into our body, you have to go for the organic ones, but the organic ones are $5 more than the non-organic ones. And then you have to think about how every single month you need at least a pack or 2, depending on how heavy your flow is, you might even need 3. You don't know how much these people are actually changing their tampons and pads, and also leading into like period poverty as well. It's like sanitation wise, you should be changing your products every like 4 to 6 hours, depending on your flow. Like tampons only should really be in you for like 4 to 6 hours, I believe. And when people can't afford period products, they're going to be leaving those in for longer, which isn't healthy for their bodies. But it's really, what choice do you have at that point? So,
And think about if you were, I don't know, 14 and you're having your period and you can't afford any kind of protection, you're either, stuffing toilet paper or newspaper or tissues in your panties that we know really don't do the trick.
Yeah.
And so you're probably going to decide not to go to school.
Absolutely.
So you're having a whole cohort of young women who are also then not getting educated on a regular basis because guess what? Every month they're menstruating. So there's, 6 or 7 days out of each month they may not be going to school.
Yeah. And when I was in high school, I don't think that there was like free and accessible period products in the women's restroom. Maybe, I mean, I can't really remember like that. It feels like a long time ago, but like
just think how I feel.
I think like maybe towards the end there was like more, but then it's also like a production of like, if it's not kept in the bathroom, you have to take time out of your day to walk into the nurse's office. You're missing class. You have to go, and then you have to go take yourself to the restroom and change out your period products. And then you like, it's a whole almost like ordeal to just like do something that shouldn't be this difficult. It should take like only a few minutes to really be doing this, but a lot of time young girls have to take a lot of time out of their day and really focus on changing these things and missing their education and then like having to come back and like the scenario over like it's a male teacher and then he's asking you like where have you been? And then in front of the whole class you have to say they're on your period, and it's like that's not a shameful thing, but it's something that you don't really want to do.
It's no one's business. I'm sorry, it's no one's fucking business. I mean, I remember talking to a mom in the office and she was asked me to write a note for her daughter because she was at some school where she needed a note to explain why she had to leave class to get her tampons out of her locker to then go to the bathroom. And, I was incensed. I really was incensed.
Yeah.
And I remember personally being a teenager and thinking, oh, I can just hold on for another 10 minutes because the bell's going to ring. I'm going to be fine. And then getting up and having blood on the seat.
Yeah.
I don't care how advanced or mature you are. It's embarrassing.
Yeah.
And the community around you, particularly of teenagers, isn't going to support you in that.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are some ways that advocates are working towards, period equality and period equity and getting rid of this luxury tax, for example?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like nonprofits that do like period drives, for lack of a better term. It's like they'll send out period kits to people that can't afford them. And I think that's like a really, really good start. I mean, I think that period products shouldn't be taxed. And I think that's like the end goal. And I also think that they should be more like affordable in general, which I think only will come with more funding, honestly, and more like education about it. But there's some websites like the Period Project, period.org, Alliance for Period Supplies. So if you're like having trouble affording period products, I would definitely recommend reaching out or even just sharing like them in general, because I think that a lot of the time people don't even know that these nonprofits and these organizations exist, and they're just kind of like going through almost like suffering. I mean, I feel like it would be really, and I think something else that would really help is just a general more sexual education. And I think that includes also educating everyone, not just people that menstruate, but like everyone should know about what's going on.
That's right.
I think separating is uncomfortable for all, because I remember learning about a man's parts and I remember learning about like erections, but then we separated when we talked about like the periods, and it's just like, I think everyone should know what's going on in each other's bodies, because I think if you're in a situation where you're the only two people in the room, you should both know what's going on. Like, and if one of those men that didn't learn about it rise to power in the future, you want them to be like advocating for your bodies as well. And I think it's really important for everyone to be educated, because it is just another natural biological process. It's not something that should be just covered up just for people that experience it. It's like, it's a normal thing. It happens. If you're like heterosexual and you're going to get into a relationship in the future, like your partner is going to have a period. It happens. So I just think everyone should be educated about the process, because there's still just such a lack of awareness surrounding it. And I think that whenever that happens in school, like it should be everyone is involved in the education of it.
I remember one of the many reasons I fell in love with my husband was when we were first dating. I didn't have time to go out and get tampons. And I asked him if he'd pick them up on his way to work. And he was like, okay. And, he did it. But I remember a brother of mine who like would never ever be seen,
Yeah.
buying tampons. And I know he wasn't alone.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. According to several national polls, 77% of Americans feel that menstrual products should be supplied in public restrooms, just like toilet paper and paper towels. So I would also encourage our listeners to go online, look up your state rules about luxury tax. There are plenty of states who have eliminated the luxury tax, but not across the country. And, given the current state of our country, it's likely that some of those legislators who have done the right thing might reverse the ruling. So please find out who you could write to, find out who you could, tell them that this tax should not exist.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it should go hand in hand with other reproductive rights and care. And I know abortion is state by state, but I think that it should go federally along with the right to choose, because that's another choice that you have to make in your body. It's like, what am I putting in my body? And I think that supplying these in public restrooms is a bare minimum, honestly. I'm sick of paying 25 cents in an emergency for a tampon. It's not fair. And I think there's a lot of other free things that are like given, and for some reason it's not period products, and I really think it's important to push for that.
You just reminded me of an event when I was a kid. Actually, I probably was in my early 20s, and we had these, I don't know if they still exist. I'm not sure I've seen them anymore, but these big metal boxes in public restrooms where you'd put in a quarter and you'd turn the dial and you'd get a box with a tampon in it or a pad. And I can't tell you how much money I've lost in those machines because they didn't work. So I'd turn it and nothing would come out. And so here you are, worried about bleeding all over your clothes. And do I have enough coins? Because of course there's never any, what are those exchanges, coin machines, right? So there's one obstacle after another after another. I remember the first time I walked into a very nice restaurant in New York City, and in the women's bathroom there was a basket full of sanitary protection. And I to this day, I remember the joy I felt and pride in this place. And I remember walking out and saying something to the managers like, right on. I mean, that is the right thing to do.
Absolutely.
That's
a place that you want to keep going back to.
That's right.
Encouraging
That's right.
reproductive health. And I think it's important that I don't know, I feel like every establishment that has a public restroom should have it. And I mean, I know it's dependent on how much they can afford, but I really think it should become a bare minimum, in my opinion, in every restroom.
Well, I think that brings us back to, economy, right? So if these sanitary protections are so expensive that not only can women not afford them, but nor can businesses afford to provide them, what would happen if businesses didn't provide toilet paper?
Exactly.
And and there are places in the world where you have to pay a fee to get some toilet paper. But I can't see that happening in America. For all the same reasons, we should be able to provide sanitary protection. And it may not be exactly what you use every day.
No, but just anything.
Just to get you by.
Just to get you by until you can get
right.
the products that you prefer. Because there is so many, you're right, period underwear, period cups. There's so many different products now, but it's just we're not asking for you to buy the salt cups for $30 and supply 50 of them. It's just get even if it has to be the cheapest tampon for now, I don't think that there should be metals that are leaching into our bodies via tampons. I think that should be an issue that is fixed within the companies. But I think that even though, if I have the choice between wrapping my underwear in toilet paper and using a tampon, I'm going to use the tampon, So it's just, absolutely.
Yeah. Lola, is there anything else that you feel like the listeners should really know about this? And I guess I'm also curious about how you see your graduate studies kind of morphing into continued interest in this subject matter.
I do want to mention that I think it's important that not only are schools educating people, because a lot of the time, you don't know what kind of education different students are getting at home, but I do think it's important for children to also be educated at home what's happening within their bodies. And the first step to deconstructing this shame is really to learn it at home. And whether or not you have a primary caregiver that menstruates, I think it's important either way to educate them about what is going to happen to their bodies, because that's the only way that they're going to not fear what's going on. And so I think both post and pre-menarche it should be happening. I think before you get your first period, you should know that it's coming and you should learn how to properly use and change a tampon and pads. And then after your first period happens, also being educated about how, when you're, I don't know what the age is exactly, but either after you first have sex for the first time or get to a certain age, you have to start going to the gynecologist every year, and you need to get tested and you need to do your pap smears. And I think that kind of stuff is really kind of missed, where it's like, okay, you get your period. Like we all, we know that's going to happen, but also the aftermath of it, of like, you could have PCOS, endometriosis. There's so many different things that could happen. So just being aware of your body and knowing like you're supposed to get it once a month roughly, but timelines will change for you. And also like just developing a good relationship with a gynecologist, I think is important, like trusting them, because I went to the gynecologist for the first time, I think when I was like 16 or 17. It was at the Planned Parenthood. I felt like my first experience, not that it was negative and they were doing what they could, but I was asking for birth control and I was immediately given birth control with no really warning of any side effects of it. I'm super like pro contraception, like absolutely, don't get me wrong. But I think that surrounding menstrual education needs also to be birth control education about like what it will do to your body, how it affects your mental health, how it affects your weight fluctuations, and how it'll actually affect your cycle. Because I think people really have not a deep understanding of what's actually happening in their bodies. And I think it all ties together. It's not just about getting your period and getting educated about like what's happening biologically. It's about all the societal and the things that are happening in tandem with it.
Absolutely. I've often had women come into the office asking me how they should speak to their children about sex, their bodies, menstruation. And there are some amazing books out there that start with just, cartoon type, graphic books, that graphic meaning cartoon like storylines telling you about your body. And what has also been demonstrated with science is that you leave a book out in the living room of a home. And guess what? That kid will look at it to the point at which they're not ready to look at it.
Absolutely.
And they really are able to monitor how much information they're able to take in. And then when they're ready to take in more, they'll take in more. And I can't tell you how many moms, will buy one of these great books and say, oh yeah, it disappeared. And, I found it under their bed and I leave it under their bed, letting them resource it when they're ready.
Yeah.
Kids want to know. They want to know about their bodies. They want to know about what's normal. And they also want to know what's abnormal. Not to create fear, but to have, again, a sense of, okay, when do I talk to somebody? When do I ask for help? And part of the shaming that has gone on around menstruation is, as you've implied, no one's talking about kind of what could go wrong. And it's always like, oh, it's going to happen once a month and this is the way.
Yeah.
But so many vulva havers have had difficulties with their periods and they've just assumed it's normal. Terribly painful periods, really heavy periods, frequent periods. And they don't have the language to just speak out and say, is this normal? Am I supposed to be going through this? What are my options? How can I feel better? I don't want to suffer every month. No one should be suffering every month.
Absolutely. And I also think that children are naturally curious, and children are also a lot smarter than we give them credit for. So either way, especially with now, like the age of technology, they're going to find out information, but it's your job as a parent or a primary caregiver to give them the information that's correct. And I think that, again, going back to the beginning when we were talking about using the coded communication and like giving your child like a sex talk at a proper age, I just think that there's almost like a common misconception around menstruation that it's like an inappropriate conversation to be having just because it deals with your genitals. And I think that that's absolutely not true, because I think that just because it's happening down there, like it doesn't necessarily mean that that's automatically inappropriate. I could get into the whole tangent of how I feel. It's like, I feel like children are really sexualized, and I think that that goes along with it. And it's not an inherently sexual thing to get your period. So it doesn't have to be the same conversation, and I think that it's just really important to grow up. Like if I ever have a daughter, I would feel like I would raise her in an environment where she could feel free to talk to me about her body, and whether that's leaving like resources out for her to read, but not forcing her to, because that can, children like to also be defiant sometimes.
Right.
But like just giving her the resources to learn about her own body and creating a space where she could ask questions and it not be awkward. Because while I was studying my research in college, I did find a positive correlation between the way people viewed their menstrual cycles, and if they viewed it in a positive way, they had a higher image of themselves and a higher body appreciation. So I think it is a much larger issue of when you feel menstrual stigma within yourself, you're going to then judge, like in very simple terms, judge your body more. And I think that there's just so much, especially around young women, so much body image issues. Like I've been through it. I'm sure every woman that's ever listened to this podcast has been through some sort of like, unhappiness within themselves with their body. And it's just so normalized. And again, with how much media we consume nowadays, it's like we're seeing so many different bodies and we have the conventional attractive bodies. And I think it's a whole conversation that has to start at a young age. And it starts honestly with menstruation and how you're going to internalize that within yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. If you see this event every month as nothing but a curse, that speaks volumes, right?
Absolutely.
About how you experience this beautiful biological function that, provides the opportunity for fertility and is a sign of health.
Yeah, right? Absolutely.
Great. So we are getting towards the end, and I just want to know, in your graduate studies, what do you look forward to kind of really continuing or focusing on? Has it evolved or changed since Bard?
Absolutely. I took some time off after college to really just honestly save up money for a graduate program.
Yeah.
And also to really like sit down and consider what I want to put my work into. So I'm planning on joining a graduate program. I'm planning to move down to Charleston, South Carolina, actually.
Oh, I hear that's a fun place.
Yeah, it's super fun down there. And I'm really excited. And I also think it's important for me because, I've grown up in a blue state my entire life. I am kind of almost looking forward to the experience of being somewhere where I can really feel like I'm doing meaningful work. Whereas in like here, I know that I can do meaningful work surrounding menstrual stigma. But I think in a state where even abortion is up in the air and it's a red state, you can really do a lot more meaningful work for the women in that area. Whereas here, it's super, accessible, which I'm so grateful to grow up into that.
Preaching to the choir.
Absolutely. I want to afford that to other people. So I'm between a few graduate programs right now, whether that's going to be continuing just like a psychology research like PhD or just being a research psychologist and getting a master's, or maybe going like the social work route so I could work in community organizing. But regardless, I really am planning on either volunteering or hopefully getting a position at like a nonprofit for I think pro-choice down there, because there's a lot of debate right now with the pro-choice and the pro-life, especially in the South. So focusing my energy on that. And then I think as I work in kind of like that sort of reproductive justice, there's also a lot of opportunity there to then educate, because it goes into the whole like contraception and safe sex talk. And I think that it's just important to start where it's hot right now almost. And I think that will become, again, like a lot more digestible to people to then be like, okay, like we're working on having a right to an abortion should be absolutely everybody's right? But beyond that, menstrual freedom and reproductive justice also goes with like period poverty and everything. So just working and neighboring with nonprofits. There's some nonprofits down there that will do like period drives. So hopefully working with them, but they're pretty small right now. So hopefully to like just like settle into like the women's rights community down there and getting my higher education in order to pursue that.
Great. I mean, you're talking about body autonomy.
Absolutely.
And in every possible way. Okay. So the last question in GynoCurious land is asking you about what gives you pleasure. If you had to mention one thing, hopefully there are many things, but one thing that gives you pleasure, what would it be, Lola?
I think having a supportive community and like friends and in my relationships, I think those are really what gives me the most pleasure. Because I think that I was lucky enough to grow up in a household and now surround myself with people that do nothing but like support me and never make me feel any sort of shame about myself or what I'm going through. And I think that it gives me so much pleasure to have that, and it would give me even more pleasure to provide that for other people as well. Like, I think just that is my main goal for my lifetime, is to just like make sure that everyone feels supported around me, like from me. And I think that's really important to me, and I'm really grateful for that.
I'm so glad to hear that, because so many young people don't have those kind of environments. So I'm so grateful you've had that in your life, and may it continue so that, yes, you could spread it around to others as well. I also want to thank Jen Hammoud and Maddie Rosenberg, my co-producers. I want to thank David Hoffman, my editor. And I want to thank the Epicurean for having us here at Radio Free Rhinecliff. To all of you who are listening, please stay well. Please listen to your instincts and intuitions. They are the greatest of teachers, not to be ignored.